Elizabeth was 27 the first time someone outside her community asked her, gently, almost carelessly, "But did you love him when you married him?" She remembers the question landing in her chest like a dropped plate. Not painful exactly, just startling. The kind of sound that makes you flinch before you understand why. She didn't know how to answer, not because the answer was complicated, but because in 22 years inside Mill Creek, the old order Mennonite settlement tucked along a quiet bend of the Shenandoah Valley, no one had ever once asked her that question. Not a friend, not her mother, not even in any real way herself. She wants to take you back to the day that question's answer actually began, though she wouldn't understand that for another 11 years. She was 18, standing in her aunt's sewing room in a half-pinned wedding dress, the September light slanting gold through the curtains. 3 older women circling her with pins in their mouths and approval in their eyes. And she started to cry. Not delicate tears, real ones, the kind that come from somewhere lower than your eyes. Her Aunt Mabel patted her shoulder and said, "Every bride cries before her wedding, sweetheart. It's just nerves." Elizabeth nodded because nodding was easier than explaining a feeling she didn't have words for yet, and she let the women finish the hem, and 3 weeks later she married a young man named David in front of the whole congregation. It would take her another 11 years to understand that what she felt in that sewing room wasn't nerves at all. It was grief. Grief for a choice she had never actually made. Before she goes any further, her name is Elizabeth, and this is Elizabeth's quiet vows. She grew up in Mill Creek, in a community where marriages were arranged through something called the choosing, and this channel is the place where she finally says out loud what that process actually felt like from the inside, for the women living through it. If this is the kind of honesty you've been looking for, she'd be grateful if you'd subscribe, tap the like button, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what she shares next. It helps more than you'd think. Now, let her tell you what no one ever explained to her plainly, even though everyone around her seemed to understand it without needing to be told. When people outside a community like Mill Creek hear that marriages there are arranged, they picture something dramatic. A father's hand forcing a daughter's down the aisle, a girl weeping and refusing at the altar, a story with a villain in it somewhere. That is almost never what it looks like. And that absence of an obvious villain is exactly what makes the whole arrangement so hard to question from the inside. What it actually looks like is the choosing, a quiet, dignified process where a young woman's parents, alongside 2 or 3 respected church elders, would identify a handful of suitable young men from good families, families with the right reputation, the right work ethic, the right standing within the order, the unwritten code that shaped every decision in Mill Creek without ever needing to be written down. The young woman would then be told gently who had been approved to call on her. She was permitted, technically, to decline a specific match. In practice, almost no one ever did. Declining wasn't forbidden. It had simply never been modeled for her as a real possibility, the way refusal so rarely is, in systems built this carefully. That distinction between something forbidden and something merely never offered is the part Elizabeth needs you to understand most. She was taught 3 things about love and marriage before she ever stood in front of a congregation to receive either. The first thing she was taught was that love is something you grow into after commitment, not something you locate before it. Feeling, affection, attraction, the fluttering nonsense the world outside made movies about, was treated as a kind of unreliable weather. Commitment came first, like planting a seed in soil you hadn't chosen yourself. Love, if it came at all, was simply what grew there over the years, the way any tended thing eventually grows. The second thing she was taught was that wanting a particular man, feeling drawn to him specifically, the way her cousin Naomi once whispered about feeling dizzy near a boy from the next district, was treated as a kind of vanity. A good match was a sensible match, a stable match, a match the elders could vouch for. Desire was suspicious precisely because it was hers. It came from inside her own wanting. and her own wanting, she had been taught since girlhood, was not a reliable compass for anything important. The third thing she was taught was that contentment in marriage was entirely her own responsibility, regardless of the match she'd been given. If she found herself unhappy, the fault lay in her own attitude, her own ingratitude, her own failure to discipline her heart toward gratefulness, never in the structure that had selected her husband for her in the first place. Happiness was a practice, not a precondition. You didn't need to want the life you were given. You only needed to learn, eventually, to want it after the fact. None of this was ever written on a list and handed to her. No one sat young Elizabeth down and explained the rules of feeling. It simply accumulated, the way water accumulates. Slow, everywhere, all at once. Until by the time she was old enough to marry, she could no longer locate the line between what she actually wanted and what she had simply been trained to accept as wanting. She wants to tell you about her wedding day itself in a little more detail than she gave you a moment ago, because the small things matter here more than the big ones. David was a good match by every measure the choosing was designed to produce. Steady, respected family, a farm with good soil 2 miles from her parents. He was not unkind, not then and not ever, in all the years that followed. When the elders told her his family had inquired, she remembers feeling almost nothing at all, not dread, not excitement, just a flat, quiet acceptance, the way you might accept that winter was coming because the calendar said so. She doesn't remember being asked if she wanted him. She remembers being told he was suitable, and she remembers understanding, without anyone needing to say it outright, that suitability and her own desire were not actually related questions. The wedding itself was lovely by every external measure, the benches full, the hymns sung the old way, unaccompanied, voices rising and falling together like something ancient breathing. David's hand was steady when he took hers. The bishop spoke about Christ and the church, about two becoming one, about covenant outlasting feeling. Elizabeth stood there in the dress she'd cried over weeks earlier, and she smiled the way a new bride is supposed to smile. And somewhere underneath the smiling, a small, clear voice she didn't yet have language for was saying, quite calmly, "I did not choose this. I only failed to refuse it." She carried that sentence with her for 12 years of marriage, mostly without noticing she was carrying it at all. There's a particular afternoon she remembers from maybe her 4th year married, sitting at a quilting frame with 3 other women from the district, needles moving in that hypnotic, companionable rhythm quilting always has. One of the younger women, recently married herself, leaned over and asked quietly, almost as a joke, "Did you know right away that you loved him?" Elizabeth remembers her own hands not even pausing on the stitch. She remembers saying, "Oh, you grow into it," the exact phrase her own mother had given her years before, handed down like a quilt pattern, worn smooth from use. The younger woman nodded, satisfied, reassured, and Elizabeth kept stitching, and underneath the stitching, that same small, clear voice said, "That isn't an answer. That's a sentence you learn to say instead of one." She wants to be careful here because she knows what some of you might already be thinking. You're thinking that arranged or guided courtship isn't automatically a tragedy, that some women inside structures like the choosing genuinely come to love the men they're matched with, build real partnerships, find a kind of devotion that grows exactly the way she was taught it would. And you'd be right. That exists. And it isn't what she's describing. A guided courtship where a young woman retains a real, exercise-demonstrated ability to say no and has actually seen that refusal used by herself or by someone she knows without consequence is something fundamentally different from a system that only offers the appearance of choice while making refusal nearly unthinkable in practice. What she's describing is a system that taught her, from the time she was old enough to understand anything, that her own desire wasn't a reliable enough thing to build a marriage on a worke, so reliable, in fact, that it could simply be set aside altogether in favor of someone else's careful judgment. If you're watching this and something about not knowing whether you ever actually chose your own life feels strangely familiar, not because you were raised Mennonite or Amish or inside any closed community at all, but because somewhere along the way you learned that your wanting wasn't trustworthy, that the safe choice always mattered more than the true one. She'd love for you to stay close. She shares stories like this every week right here. If it would help, go ahead and subscribe. Tap that like button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. It matters more than she can easily say. There's more she hasn't told you yet. Here's the part that surprised her most. Even now, years after the divorce, years of slowly learning to trust her own preferences again. David was not a villain in this story. He never raised his voice in anger toward her, not once in 12 years. He had been raised inside the exact same water she had, taught that the choosing's approval was itself a form of love, that headship was a duty assigned to him the way her contentment had been assigned to her, that a marriage which functioned smoothly, without conflict, without visible unhappiness, was by definition a successful one. He had never been asked if he loved her either. He had simply been told she was suitable, and he had married her the way you accept good weather and, gratefully, without examining it too closely. Elizabeth told a therapist, years after leaving, about that sewing room, about the pins, the dress, the tears, her aunt's reassurance that it was only nerves. The therapist was quiet for a long moment and then said, "That wasn't nerves. That was grief, for a choice you were never given the chance to make." Elizabeth sat with that sentence the way you sit with cold water on a hot day, a kind of shock that's also, somehow immediately, a relief. Because the therapist was right. She hadn't been growing into love the way she'd been promised she would. She had been quietly mourning for over a decade, a version of her own life that had never been offered to her in the first place. And that gap, between mourning and growing, between consenting and choosing, that gap, it turns out, is everything. The decision to ask David for a separation took her almost 2 years to actually carry out once she'd named the feeling honestly to herself. The community's response was swift and, in its own quiet way, absolute. Divorce inside Mill Creek wasn't simply discouraged. It was treated as something closer to a wound in the body of the whole congregation, something requiring distance and silence to heal properly, even when the silence fell hardest on the person who'd asked the hardest questions. Her mother stopped answering her calls for the better part of a year. Letters came back unopened. The bishop visited David twice, she later learned, and never visited her once. She doesn't tell you this for sympathy. She tells you because leaving is the part people always want to know about, and leaving taught her, more clearly than the marriage itself ever had, exactly how deep the conditioning ran. Because even after the papers were filed, even after she had her own small rented house outside Harrisonburg, her own job at a fabric shop, her own income for the first time in her adult life, even then, the old instinct to defer, to assume someone else's judgment was more trustworthy than her own wanting, didn't stay behind in Mill Creek. It rode along with her in the car. She caught herself more than once in those early months, agreeing to plans she didn't actually want, simply because agreement had been her native language for 30 years, and disagreement still felt like speaking underwater. You carry the old water with you long after you've climbed out of the river it came from. The evening she finally told David the whole truth, she was shaking, though by then it wasn't fear of him making her shake. It was the sheer unfamiliarity of saying something so plainly true out loud after so many years of not. She sat across from him at the same kitchen table, where they'd eaten 10,000 quiet meals together, and she said, "I never chose you, David. I consented to you, and for 12 years I let myself believe those were the same thing." She braced herself for hurt, maybe even anger. What crossed his face instead was something closer to recognition. He looked down at his own hands for a long moment, and then he said quietly, "I'm not sure I ever chose you either. I think I consented too. I just never had a reason to notice the difference until you said it." Neither of them was angry in that conversation. Mostly they were tired. Two people finally looking honestly at all the years they'd spent performing a closeness that had been arranged for them rather than discovered by them, wondering what it might have felt like to have actually had the chance to choose each other, or to choose someone else, or simply to choose at all. They didn't reconcile, not in the way some of you watching might be hoping for. But that evening, Elizabeth understood something she's carried with her ever since. A system like the choosing doesn't only cost the women caught inside it. It costs everyone touched by it. It costs the husbands the chance to ever be genuinely, freely chosen instead of simply installed. It costs marriages the experience of being a real union between two whole, separately arrived at decisions, instead of two people quietly performing a union they were each handed before they understood what one was supposed to feel like. It costs faith communities the difference between a covenant that was freely entered and one that was simply inherited and rehearsed. And it takes all of this so gently, so without drama, that most people living inside it never even notice exactly what's been taken from them. If you grew up believing that love was something assigned to you rather than something you got to choose, she sees you. If you were taught that your own wanting wasn't trustworthy enough to build a life around, you are not alone in that. If you have ever stood in a half-pinned dress, crying real tears, and let someone else call it nerves because you didn't yet have the word for grief, she sees you too. You were allowed to want something different. You still are. 3 years after the divorce, Elizabeth met a man named Thomas at the fabric shop where she worked. No choosing, no elders, no families inquiring on anyone's behalf. Just two adults who kept finding reasons to talk longer than the conversation strictly required. When he eventually asked her to marry him, she remembers sitting with the question for almost a full minute before answering, turning it over carefully, checking it against herself the way you might check a fabric for flaws before cutting it. And when she finally said yes, it was the first time in her entire life she could say, with total certainty, that the choice had genuinely been hers to make. If any part of this reached something in you, she'd be grateful if you'd subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what she shares next time. There's still so much more she hasn't said. Until next time, let your own wanting matter. It was always allowed to.